الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Welcome to Understanding Islam. This week we come to Program 3, when we're going to trace the passage of Greek wisdom into the Arab lands and then through the Muslim lands back into Europe and eventually back to the Christian West as well. A lot of dates, a lot of names, so if you want to get the details, you best to go to the website and download the article that goes with this program. Now, first of all, we have to ask, how does Greek wisdom get to be in a position that it can come into the hands of Muslims? Greek wisdom was passing into Egypt nearly 1,000 years before the rise of Islam. The great city of Alexandria on the Egyptian coast was a center of Greek learning way back 300-400 years before the Common Era. And from here, trade lines were being set up to India, so that this wisdom was passing not only to Alexandria, but through there, down through trade routes, all the way as far as India. In the 4th century before the Common Era, the Greeks captured the ancient cities of Persia, and therefore Greek wisdom was spreading in a band all the way from the Mediterranean, Alexandria, right the way through Persia as far as the Punjab. And once it's reached that far, people are working on it. So we see developments in Sanskrit, we see developments in Persian. And so this is an ongoing process that predates the time of Islam. What sort of wisdom are we talking about here? Well, in our modern terms, we're talking about natural science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. And some of the great names from the Greek tradition that we associate with these disciplines are already linked with the Arab lands. So we think of Plotinus, for example. He's an Egyptian. Porphyry, he's a Syrian. We think of Euclid. Euclid worked at Alexandria, so we can see this intimate link that comes far before the time of Islam. One of the things that was already happening before the rise of Islam is that these works were being translated into Syriac. Now, Syriac was the language that was being used in places like Syria. It's a Semitic language like Hebrew and Aramaic and also Arabic. Most of the work that was going into Syriac at this time were medical writings. So we can think of the writings of Hippocrates. We can think of Galen, the Hippocratic Oath. We recognize this name. So this was coming into Syriac and was being used mainly by Syriac Nestorian Christians who were the great physicians and the medical people of that period. There are two routes by which Greek knowledge was reaching India. One was this trade route from Alexandria by sea. The other one was the land route that passed through Central Asia, through Afghanistan, through Persia, and into North India in that way, so that Greek knowledge is permeating and being influenced by North India as well. Now, it's important that when we speak of Greek knowledge, we're not speaking here of ethnicity. We're not speaking of Greek people, but rather Greek-speaking people. So many different nationalities and different religions too. Christians, Jews, but also the peoples of India, Hindus, Buddhists, were contributing to this process before the rise of Islam. As soon as the Muslims arrived in Damascus, they were immediately aware that there was a much higher culture, a higher civilization here than they had enjoyed in the deserts from which they came. And so they embraced it, but then they began to question, how can we get the best out of this high culture, this Greek wisdom? And so we begin to see, even in those early decades in Damascus, the beginning of translation of Greek wisdom, first of all from Syriac into Arabic, and then also from Greek into Syriac and into Arabic. So there is a sense in which this is something that we should engage with. That sense becomes much stronger once we come to the Abbasid period, because the Abbasids were the dominant regime of those middle centuries of Islam from 750 up until 1258. The Abbasids settled their empire with its capital at Baghdad. Now consider what Baghdad is, that it's in a meeting place between Egypt to the east, Persia to the Near East, but also to the wisdom of Greece from the Mediterranean lands to the west from there. So Baghdad is a cultural meeting place. The city of Baghdad is founded as the capital of the Abbasid Empire in 762, but it's a multi-ethnic, a multilingual, and a multi-religious city from the beginning. So we have Jews, Christians, and Muslims living there. We have people who are speaking Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit. We have people who are Arabs, who are Indians, Central Asians, Europeans, Berbers, Turks, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And this is what we're calling now this Arabic civilization under Muslim rule. Now you need three things to get an intellectual flourishing. One is that you need some material to start the process off, and this Greek wisdom that was inherited was going to serve that function. Secondly, you need money, because you need to be able to give the scholars the leisure that they need to do the work. And the Abbasids had money because they had revenue coming in to the central headquarters of the vast Abbasid Empire. And thirdly, you need a vision. And the vision was, we are bearers of the final message from God. The hand of God is upon us, blessing us, guiding us. Therefore, we are the natural inheritors of all the wisdom of the earth. So we are bringing home this knowledge to its rightful place, which is under the direction of Islam. So those three things were able to trigger off this process. Already by this stage, the great centers of Quranic studies, of Islamic studies, of Arabic language were close by in Iraq at Basra and Kufa. So what happens then is that the caliph invites the theologians, as we would say, the religious scholars, to come from there to Baghdad. And so now we begin to get an interflow between the Islamic sciences, religion, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Baghdad is the center and the hub where it's all happening. We begin to get the first translations in Baghdad coming from that eastern region. So we're getting people translating from Persian into Arabic and from Sanskrit into Arabic. And so Baghdad is the cultural meeting spot. Once the Abbasid Caliphate was centered at Baghdad and money began to flow there, we can see that quite a lot of that money was being used in the process of acquiring manuscripts and commissioning people to translate them. This was being done by the caliph, so it was the official practice, but it was also being done by lots of individuals. So we get the beginning of private libraries, of wealthy people putting up money and sending off manuscript hunters to bring back to Baghdad the manuscripts of Greek, Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit origin. It was at this time, around about the year 820, that the Beit al-Hikmah was founded. Beit al-Hikmah means the House of Wisdom. It's not terribly easy to understand what the Beit al-Hikmah was. It was certainly a centre for translation, a library, but it was also a place for scholars to meet. So there was a regular majlis there, or a seminar, when the scholars would meet to discuss the finer points of their newly acquired learning. This process of translation really gets underway in the 9th century. So we're talking about philosophical, medical, scientific, astronomical, mathematical works. We're talking about the source languages. Greek, yes, but also Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit. Quite often medical material was coming from the Greek through Sanskrit and then from Sanskrit into Arabic, because Sanskrit was the language of the Christian Nestorian medics, the physicians, and they it were who were responsible for the transmission of that medical knowledge. If we take a man like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, for example, he is translating Greek works into Arabic. And we're talking here dozens of works, from Galen, from Hippocrates, from Archimedes, Euclid, from Ptolemy, from Aristotle. And so we can see all these names that are familiar to us from the Greek corpus of literature are now being translated into Arabic. Now, translating works is one thing, but they then need to be copied so that they can be circulated and used. And a crucial factor in this process is the availability of quantities of paper. Paper was originally developed in China. It comes across as far as Samarkand by the 8th century. By the 9th century, it's in Baghdad. Not just paper, but quantities of paper, so that you can copy multiply onto paper sheets. They are then bound into a book, a codex, and that then protects them. It protects them in transit as well as in use. The spread of paper production comes up not only from Baghdad, but also from the Maghreb, in Cairo, in Damascus. We see these great centers of paper manufacture and the impact that that has on the whole process of the distribution of knowledge. Another crucial development that takes place in the 9th century is that we move from being a translator to being an author. You see, it's one thing to translate the works and therefore to gain from the ancient wisdom of Greece, but then people of intelligence, having translated them, said, oh, but we can improve on this, we can take this further, we can write our own material. So if we take a man like Thabit ibn Qurra, for example, from the 9th century, he begins by translating works from Greek, and then he authors 150 works in his own right. And we're dealing here with logic and mathematics, with medicine and astronomy. So a whole range of material is now being developed in Arabic, not just translated into it. Another person that we can think of in this regard is the great mathematician, the father of algebra, al-Khwarizmi. Now, he then takes algebraic work from India and he develops a system, general principles, so that you can apply them to all algebraic formulae. He takes the decimal system and he takes the numerals from Sanskrit and he transforms them into Arabic. And the Arabic numbers with which we're familiar today are really built up around the use of how many angles do they contain. So the number 1 contains 1 angle, 2 contains 2 angles, 3 angles, and so on. A crucial thing that he also does is to introduce the concept of zero. Zero has no angles. Zero as a placeholder, so that you can now begin to do much more complicated calculations. And he transforms the decimal system from being vertical to being horizontal. It was vertical because it was written on a dust board originally, and then you shook the board and cleared it. Now that you've got paper, you can write it horizontally across the page, and so we get the kind of numerical system with which we are familiar today. He wasn't just, though, a mathematician. He was also an astronomer. He was preparing star maps. He was preparing a map of the world. One of the things that we notice in this period is that people often were the masters of several different disciplines. They weren't just specialized in their own field. It's important to remember that we're talking about a society that worked in the Arabic language, not Arabs ethnically. And we can see this whole process of gaining from Greek knowledge spreading throughout the Islamic Empire. In Fez, for example, the great mosque college of Fez was created in 859. The daughter of the ruler pledged to give all her inheritance to forward a center of learning in that place. And we're told that she fasted throughout the period of construction to invoke God's blessing upon it, and it became a center of mathematics and medicine and astronomy, as well as the Islamic sciences. It was, however, in the newly created city of Cairo that we see a huge development. Now, the ancient Egyptian city of Fustat was the first Muslim capital, but in 969, the Fatimid dynasty rose up and took control of that territory, and they created a new capital, the new city of Cairo, in 972. By 978, they start creating and founding the Mosque University of Al-Azhar, and Al-Azhar becomes a great center of learning, not just in the Fatimid Ismaili community, but also it is a center of learning that continues right down to our own times. Now, the Fatimids were Ismailis. Their religious tradition was very much influenced by a variety of Greek writings, and so this became a great center of translation and learning. The House of Knowledge was built there, and we're told that there were 40 rooms dedicated to housing the books, and there are some 18,000 works in translation in this library. Now, this is truly massive when we think that we haven't yet reached the year 1000. The Fatimids developed courses there, circles of study for both men and women in the Al-Azhar, so that they could read and study and progress this new learning. In 1171, Salahuddin captured Cairo. That was the end of the Fatimid dynasty, and then it reverted from being an Ismaili Shia center to being a Sunni center, and it continues to this day as one of the great centers of Sunni learning in the whole of the Muslim world, more than 1,000 years after its founding. The Umayyad Caliphate of Spain set up its capital in Cordoba, which was the administrative capital, but also the center of learning. There were Jews, Christians, and Muslim scholars who were working together in this place. They weren't just Arabs. Some of them were native Spanish. Some of them were coming from much further afield, from Persia, from Central Asia. But Arabic was their language for academic work. Cordoba, by the 9th century, had a very high and established center of culture and civilization. We read that there were paved streets, there was street lighting with oil burners, there was piped water, and there were sewerage canals, so that people who lived there enjoyed a very high cultural life. The great library of Cordoba by the year 1000 is reputed to have held 400,000 volumes. One of the things that we also know from the records of Cordoba is the role that was played there by women scholars. They were librarians and secretaries to the caliph. They were book collectors, poets, writers in their own right. They were copyists. We're told that in one quarter of the city of Cordoba alone, there were 120 women who specialized in copying manuscripts in the Kufic script. Now, to be a high-quality copyist was not just about penmanship, but it was also about adding marginal notes, making additions to the learning so that you could say, this is what the original work says, but I've added this to it. So it's a productive way of moving forward. Let's just take one example of the breadth of learning that some of these scholars portrayed. So if we take al-Biruni, for example, from the 11th century. Now, he is obsessed with measurement, with time, with distance. So he calculates the circumference of the earth, but he also calculates the speed of the heavenly bodies, how quickly they're moving. To do that, he needs an observatory, and that's built in Baghdad. But in addition to that, he works in pharmacy as well, developing medicines from nature. But he's also a historian. He meets people who've come from India, and he writes then the history of India on the basis of what he's learned from them. And finally, he's also a historian of religion. So he writes a book on the history of the great religions of the world. If we think about medicine, a great deal of the contribution here is in the field of medicine. Al-Razi from the 10th century is called the father of Arab medicine. But his work is taken forward by a whole variety of different people. We can think about Ibn al-Haytham, for example, from the 11th century, the father of optics. He it is who's working on the camera obscura, for example. He's working on the structure of the eye. He it is who comes to work out the way in which light enters the eye, instead of the eye transmitting light, which is what some of the early Greeks thought. The theme of eyes takes us on to the work of al-Masuli. He is developing techniques of eye surgery. In addition to that, we have Ibn Sina, who's working not only in medicines, but also in the bones anatomy, what happens when you have a fracture, how best to set the bone after a fracture. If we go forward another couple of centuries to Ibn Nafis, he's working out the pulmonary circulation of the blood in the 13th century. So we can see huge steps being taken forward in the history of medicine during this period. One of the most important disciplines that was translated into Arabic was philosophy. The Greeks had a very rich philosophical tradition from the writings of Plato, of Socrates, of Aristotle, for example, but also from the Neoplatonic school. So in the 9th century, Al-Kindi is regarded as being the father of Arab philosophy, and he is steeped in Aristotelian thought. A little later, dying in 750, we have Al-Farabi, and Al-Farabi is knowledgeable both in the Aristotelian system and also in the Neoplatonic system, and then he tries to integrate the two in his own writings. The two most important of the Arabic philosophers, so important in the history of Europe that they are both given Latin names, are Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. Ibn Sina, who died in 1037, we've met him already in terms of his work on bones and fractures. But he also developed a whole system of medicines, of drugs that could be obtained from natural sources. His works in medicine were still in use in Europe up until the early 18th century. But in philosophy, he was a commentator on the metaphysics of Aristotle, and he took the understanding of the soul, for example, many steps further from that which was there originally in the Arabic text. He is called in European history Avicenna. The other great philosopher of this period is Ibn Rushd, who dies in 1198. He is, in Latin terminology, Averroes. Apart from being a philosopher, he's also a legal scholar and a physician. But it's his philosophy that has the most major impact, because he writes commentaries in Arabic on the major works of Aristotle. They're called the long commentaries. And he also writes paraphrases of the works of Aristotle. They're called the middle commentaries. Now, the middle commentaries are to be translated into Hebrew, and they then have a big impact in the development of Jewish thinking. The long commentaries are to be translated into Latin, and they then have a profound influence in Christian Europe. But we need to ask the question, how did that translation into Latin and Hebrew take place? The dominant country for this translation from Arabic into Latin is Spain, because it is in Spain that Christians, Muslims, and Jews are living side by side during the period of Muslim rule. But from 1031 onwards, the fall of Cordoba, we see that Christians are beginning to take control of larger and larger sections of Spain. So the city of Toledo, for example, comes under Christian rule from 1085. Now, the rulers of Toledo then realized that they had an amazing opportunity here of getting Jews, Christians, and Muslims to work together to translate the knowledge that they had acquired from Arabic into Latin. And so it was in Toledo that the first great copy bureau was set up. Toledo, 1142, the abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, came on visitation to visit his monastery there. And he, together with the Archbishop of Toledo at this time, Archbishop Raimondo, dies in 1151, he was a monk of Cluny. And so these two men of Cluny conspired together to create a translation bureau in Toledo. And they called together people who knew Latin and Hebrew and Arabic so that this work could be furthered in pairs. Now, let's just touch on the Hebrew work for a moment before we forget it, because quite a lot of important work was translated at this stage from Arabic into Hebrew. The Jewish scholars of Spain, men like Moses Maimonides, for example, who dies in 1204, Maimonides is regarded as the greatest Jewish systematic theologian of the medieval period. He works in the philosophy of Aristotle, and he writes in Arabic, but he also reads and writes Hebrew. And so the process of translating into Hebrew becomes very important, and later works will come back to Western Europe through Hebrew into Latin as well. But it's the work of translation into Latin that we need to really concentrate on. There were people here from a variety of European countries, from Britain, from England, from Scotland, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy, and they were brought because they had the necessary skills not only to translate but also to understand the work that they were translating. And what often happened then is that you paired up two people, one who knew Arabic very well and had some Latin, and he would translate it roughly into Latin, and then the second person would come along and would polish the Latin to make it flow as a piece of Latin prose. And in this way, hundreds of works were translated in Toledo. The works of Ibn Rushd, and therefore of Aristotle, of Ibn Sina, scientific works, medical works, works of mathematics, these were all translated here in Toledo into Latin. Now, another center where this is important is in Sicily. Remember that Sicily started to come under Islamic rule from the 8th century onwards. But then it was retaken by the Christian Normans in the 11th century, and by around about 1200 it had come then under Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Frederick could read Latin and he could read Arabic, and he was very keen to see that Arabic wisdom should be translated into the scholarly language of Europe. So he commissioned works to be translated in Sicily, and even more importantly, he created the new University of Naples in 1224, and it was the University of Naples that was to be one of the great vehicles for transmitting the knowledge that had been acquired from Arabic into Latin to the rest of Europe. Naples University, one of its very earliest students was a man called Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, who dies in 1274, together with his teacher Albert the Great, who actually outlives him and dies in 1280. These two men, Albert and Thomas Aquinas, were the two great Christian systematic theologians of the medieval period working in Paris. And they received the work of Ibn Sina and of Ibn Rushd in the new Latin commentaries, and they were able then to interrogate it and to work with it. And if you read the work of Thomas Aquinas, he is constantly referring to the commentator. Here I agree with the commentator when he says, here I think the commentator has got it wrong, etc. Now the commentator is Ibn Rushd, Averroes. And they realize, having worked on these Latin translations, that actually they weren't very good. And so what they needed was a fresh translation from the Greek into Latin. Now in 1204, the Crusaders, going on the Fourth Crusade, had actually not reached the Holy Land, but had instead turned to Constantinople, and they had attacked and sacked that city. That meant that just around the same time, access was being made available in the Western Church to those Greek manuscripts in Constantinople, and so people like Aquinas and Albert the Great were requesting translations to be made into Latin so that they could understand that work as well. And now we see we've come complete circle. The ancient wisdom of Greece has gone through Alexandria, through the Middle East, into India. It has come into the Islamic hands in Baghdad. Then it's been furthered and developed and translated through Arabic. And now finally through Spain and through Sicily, it has returned to Western Europe, this time in Latin. And this is then going to create the next intellectual flourishing in Western Europe. Join me next week when we're going to look at the sifting and collecting of the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. I look forward to seeing you then.